Greetings. Let's try that again. Greetings. As most of you know, my name is Hank Clark. I'm program coordinator of the Political Economy Project. Wonderful to see all of you here this evening. Check our website. We have 2 public events per week for each of the 3 forthcoming weeks, and check out our website for details. Some of them will be of interest to you for certain. But let's get straight to the business at hand here, and it really is a remarkable occasion that we are at. In the 12 years that the Political Economy Project has been at Dartmouth College, we've not had a speaker series remotely like the one that is concluding this evening. Professor Meir Kohn has given us 5 wonderful lectures already. 4 of them are up on YouTube on our website. The other one will be there shortly. And with this talk tonight, Managers and Entrepreneurs, we bring the series to a close. And he needs no introduction at this point. I suspect without any further ado, won't you please join me in welcoming Meir Kohn.
Thank you very much, Hank. So first of all, as I always have done in this series, I want to thank the people involved. Hank for organizing it, Ross Muirhead, who had the idea originally, and George Records, who is sponsoring it and who's been a sponsor of the PEP in general and very valuable. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about managers and entrepreneurs, and I'm going to begin with kind of making it clear what I mean by managers and entrepreneurs, what they are and how they differ. So you can understand them by the differences in what they do. They act differently, and we'll see that for some situations, some problems, the managerial mode is the correct one, makes sense, and for other things, the entrepreneurial mode is the sensible one. Well, let's see what that means. For managers, the goals are given. He knows exactly what he's trying to do. The means are given. And his task is to figure out the best way to use the means to achieve the goals. Okay? So the skills required for that are calculation and smarts, intelligence. Okay? You need to figure it out. An example of a situation where this is the natural mode of behavior is in planning or organizing production of a given product. You have the product, you have your production facilities, you know what they can do, and you have to figure out exactly how to produce this particular product. In principle, there's a right answer. With the same information, all sensible people will make more or less the same choice, find the same solution. With good managers, success is assured. Okay, I'm saying these things, we'll see it's different when we come to entrepreneurs. And failure is a sign of bad management. There shouldn't be failure, okay? For entrepreneurs, the goals and the means are not given, okay? The entrepreneur is seeking new and better goals and means. Skills required, alertness, for opportunities in particular, imagination, where you can say, oh, this is an opportunity, this is something we could do. An example of where this is appropriate is in the development of new products. Okay, you're in a firm that makes smartphones and you want to do something new, and okay, what should you do? Okay. So it's what to produce versus how to produce it. With the same information, different entrepreneurs will make very different choices. And you don't know in advance who's right. Okay, you'll find out. If somebody does, you'll see, this was a good idea, this wasn't a good idea. Generally, you can't tell in advance. Okay, so if you ask a lot of people, the majority isn't necessarily right. It may be the one person who disagrees with everybody else. He's the person who has it right. okay? With the entrepreneurial mode, failure is part of the process, okay? It's even for the best entrepreneurs. And the reason is partly because you don't know how it's going to turn out, okay? You have to give it your best shot. But another reason is it's not all bad. You learn from failure. That's how you learn, okay? And there's entrepreneurs have a motto: fail again, fail better. Okay, so even successive failures are not something. So with entrepreneurs, a lack of failure might be a bad sign. Okay, it means they're not trying exciting enough things, okay, risky enough things. All right. So the next thing is to think about how the activity might be organized. If you're not acting alone but have people working for you, managerial and entrepreneurial activities require different forms of organization. So with managerial, you figured out what needs to be done, and the purpose of the organization is to make sure that it is done in the way that you've planned, okay? So it's centralized, top down, and the incentives to the people working for you are usually in the form of rewards for meeting metrics. Okay, we'll say how long this should take, how many you can produce in a week, all these sorts of things. Okay, so there are metrics, and you give them incentive in terms of those metrics. With entrepreneurial, there is no precise plan. You need to feel your way. You know we're trying to do more or less this, and we need to find out what this actually is by working on it. And you need to respond to how it's going, to new information. Okay, you can change. You could do something completely different in the end from what you started thinking you were going to do. So here is going to be decentralized. The decisions, a lot of important decisions are delegated to the people who are actually doing things, okay? And the trick for the entrepreneur is finding good people, of course, that will do these things. The incentives usually is skin in the game, okay? If the thing's a success, you share in the success as someone involved in the process. Okay. Many activities or enterprises, organizations require both. So enterprises face a range of problems. Some require optimization, planning, calculation. Some require entrepreneurship. We already have the example of manufacturing, production of existing products, development of new ones. Okay, and a problem, there's a book on this, it's a real subject, is how do you combine them in one organization? Okay, it's not that simple. So we're going to look at some aspects of this. An interesting thing is that often even something that is in principle managerial, you can improve by adding an element of entrepreneurship, okay? And I'm going to give you some examples. First example is Toyota, okay? They have an assembly line for assembling automobiles, but unlike sort of the classical Ford, Taylor paradigm, they give agency to the people working on the line. In particular, they want them, okay, it's not just it's permitted, they want them, if they see a problem, a fault in the stuff that they're working on, they should stop. There's a stop button that you push. Everything stops, people come, look at it, fix it, deal with it, and then they continue. So this slows things down, but they think it's worth it, because the result is they have a much better product quality. Okay, it used to be, okay, so half our cars are defective, but we'll fix them when when they're out there. Half is an exaggeration. So Toyota, the idea was none of our cars will be defective. We won't need to fix them, and people will notice this and will sell more cars. I'm a big Toyota fan. I've had very good experience with this. All right. So that's one example. There's a book called Freedom, Inc., which shows that this principle is true much more generally. And I'll just read you an excerpt from it. When entrepreneurs build a culture of freedom and a trusting, liberated, and non-hierarchical work environment, the companies they lead tend to outperform their rivals. In businesses as diverse as insurance, winemaking, advertising, and hydraulics, all dealt with in the book, the shift from traditional authoritarian command and control structures to a culture that liberates the individual initiative of employees has dramatically enhanced results and workforce morale. Okay? Another example. Elon Musk. Okay, I was just before the election. I mean, not because of that. I was just reading this a new biography that looked interesting, and I was listening to it. The author did a biography of Steve Jobs that I found fantastic, so I had hope. I learned a lot from it. He's an entrepreneurial engineer. He's by training an engineer, and he's very entrepreneurial. And he founded and runs Tesla and SpaceX, in case you didn't know. I think by now everyone knows. But he had an innovation in how they were both organized. And in particular, it was because he was trying, like with the rockets, he was trying to produce them faster and cheaper, okay, and reusable. Those were his goals. And this innovation in organization came up fairly naturally in this. That is, he ended the separation of product development and production. Okay, and in his companies, engineers developing new products must spend time on the factory floor, seeing the consequences of their design decisions for production. So, for example, a relatively small decision that could be done a little bit, it could be a little bit different, could save a lot of money and a lot of time in production. But the typical way of doing it, where there's this separation between the two activities, you lose that. So he has people, he requires his product development people to spend time looking at how production works and how it could be improved and how the design could be changed in ways that make production easier and cheaper. And he himself spends a lot of time on the factory floor. Okay, he's the CEO, but he really enjoys doing that and looking at it. He's always asking questions and couldn't we get rid of this step and do it faster and all this kind of thing. Okay, and the principle even applies to the military. You know, that's sort of the classical top-down activity. But observers have noticed that in the battles between Ukrainian and Russian forces, the Ukrainians actually do a lot better, other things equal. I mean, it depends on size and all this kind of thing. But other things equal, the Ukrainians seem to be much more successful. And the reason they've come up with is that the Ukrainians are trained in Western methods, okay, often by Western people. And it's part of the Western approach that commanders at on the battlefield, okay, have a lot of discretion to modify and change the orders that they had to take advantage of opportunities and not to do things that in the light of what's happening are idiotic, okay, and will lead to disaster. And they don't have to get it approved. It's okay, they can make the decision, okay? And this works extremely well. And there's a saying associated with a Prussian General von Moltke, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Okay, it's nice to have a good plan, but the enemy has ideas as well, and you have to adapt. All right, now we're going to go in the other direction. So we've seen that introducing an element of entrepreneurial into the managerial can improve it. But in the other direction, we're going to look at what happens when managerial is imposed on an essentially entrepreneurial activity. Okay? And it's not good to give it away. So we're going to look at a couple of examples first. One example is 3M. Okay, 3M was a famously major innovator, a tremendously successful company. I read about it. I had a reading group with Jane Jacobs' book, The Economy of Cities, where she talks about 3M at length. I remember the example. The founder of 3M, or a long-time president in the 1920s, declared, if you put fences around people, you get sheep. Give people the room they need. And one example of that, 3M scientists were allowed to and encouraged to, required to, devote 15% of their work hours to what were called passion projects, things that they thought were really interested in and they wanted to pursue. They didn't need anyone's okay for that. Okay, so they had a lot of freedom. An example that I remember from Jane Jacobs is the Post-it note, okay, that came out of this. So initially, 3M was a mining company. They mined sand, and at one stage they decided, well, we could add a product, we could make sandpaper. Okay, and they tried making sandpaper, and all the adhesives they tried were lousy. The sand didn't stick to the paper sufficiently strongly. So they got interested in adhesives. They had an adhesives department, and they developed all kinds of things involving adhesives, like 3M tape, for example. They started with masking tape, they moved to other kinds of tape, and so on and so forth. One of the adhesives that they developed, they tried, was they thought defective because it was really very weak. Okay, it did adhere, but it was pretty easy just to separate it. Okay, and they were on the verge of tossing it out, and someone said, "Oh, I have an idea. I've for a long time wanted to have something, a bookmark that I can put in my prayer book, when I go to church, and I could make one with this adhesive on it that would stick to the page, okay, but would come off without doing any harm, would make a very nice bookmark." And they said, "Okay, well, why don't you go ahead, try that." And from that idea developed the Post-it, Post-it note, yeah. That's what they used, that adhesive, okay? Huge bestseller for 3M. But more recently, 3M has not been doing well. And the reason is there's been a change in the culture. They had a big lawsuit. One of their products caused some environmental damage and cost them a lot of money, the settlement. So they became much more risk averse, and they haven't been producing new products. Okay, they have a much more top-down managerial regime there, and they're not doing very well. Another example of another firm that was pretty big success for a long time was Boeing. Okay, at some stage, Boeing merged with or acquired McDonnell Douglas. Okay, and the reason it was up for purchase was it wasn't doing very well. And the reason it wasn't doing very well, it had a managerial culture, not an entrepreneurial culture. For some reason I don't understand, this spread to Boeing. Okay, Boeing became managerial as well, and had a lot of consequent disasters. So the 737 MAX disaster, you may have heard of it, a plane they produced. There were several crashes and so on. And the reason it happened is they wanted to produce a plane like this, and rather than starting from scratch, producing something good, they decided it would be cheaper, they were more interested in cutting costs, to modify an existing plane to meet the requirement. That didn't turn out well. So that was the reason for this. So focusing on cost cutting rather than on the product, not good. That's managerial. All right. It happens in government too. And the Columbia failure, it was satellite launch that went wrong and people died. So early NASA was very entrepreneurial, and their philosophy was every day, every exercise, and every piece of new information should be evaluated and debated in a culture that resembles an R&D lab. So very entrepreneurial. As a result, there was a near disaster with Apollo 13. There's apparently a movie, which I haven't seen. You've seen it? Yeah? Okay. And they were able to, a problem showed up after launch, and they were used to dealing with these things, and they dealt with it successfully, and there was no disaster. With Columbia, before its launch, people noticed that there were pieces of loose foam on the rocket, like on the booster. Okay, and they didn't know where they came from, but it didn't look good. And they wanted to investigate, and the people in charge did not want to be late. Okay, they had a schedule, and they wanted Columbia to launch on time. It did launch on time, but the results was a disaster, and it could have been prevented. Okay, if they had the old NASA culture rather than the new one. All right, so now I'm going to move into sort of a more general area on which this sheds considerable light, and that is. You must have noticed a theme from me, those who've taken Econ 26 and heard various talks about government doing things is generally doesn't turn out well, okay? And let's call it for government failure, okay? When government takes on a task, whether it's healthcare, education, it doesn't do that great with the military these days either. It's not done very well. And it turns out that what we've been looking at, the effect of imposing managerial planning behavior on something that is essentially entrepreneurial, is at the core of the problem. That's why governments do everything so badly, because they're by their very nature managerial, command and control, okay? The things, when they're intervening in the economy, doing something, we'll talk about lots of examples, the economy is essentially entrepreneurial, okay? So the government intervention is an imposition of the managerial approach to something that is inherently entrepreneurial, and as we've seen, that never turns out well. And government can't do things any other way. Okay, actually, there's been an attempt, there were attempts at government venture capital in a number of countries, okay? And there's a book evaluating this, and the title gives you a kind of hint of the conclusion. The book is called Boulevard of Broken Dreams. Okay, so not a big success. A managerial organization can't do venture capital, okay? Not good. Okay, so let's look at examples, okay? The most extreme example is simply a planned economy, okay? The government takes over an economy and manages it, nothing else. There isn't anything except the government's management. We had a talk on this, right? The difference between communism and capitalism. So in that talk, I suggested the important difference between them was capitalism, a market economy, a commercial economy. The key is commerce is at the center of things, okay? And I don't remember if we talked about it then, but why that matters so much is that commerce is essentially entrepreneurial. So it is itself entrepreneurial, and it facilitates entrepreneurial behavior by others. So you get a lot of entrepreneurial behavior, and that's what makes the economy work, grow, and so on, okay? In a planned economy, that's absent. No commerce, no entrepreneurship. Okay. So complete planning is a disaster. Now we're going to look at examples of partial planning. Okay, so government interventions, including regulation. Regulation is imposition of a plan. You have to do things this way, okay, or you must not do these things. Okay, that's a form of planning. So the first example of planning on a small scale is industrial policy. So here, the government isn't planning the whole economy, but it is essentially planning a particular industry. Okay, there's a big literature. There aren't any examples of successful industrial policies. All right. So the natural development of an industry is the result of entrepreneurship. The plan prevents that, so don't do well. Another example, more surprising maybe, is stabilization, macro policy. That's a plan too. Okay, the government now is going to manage the economy, the macroeconomy, the economy as a whole. And experience with that is that government macro policy, monetary and fiscal, is not stabilizing, but rather a source of instability. And people will say, well, what about the Great Depression? Okay, so that's been studied a lot, including by Doug Irwin of the PEP, and who's going to be giving a talk in 2 weeks, I think. And he found very much, and lots of others have found in different ways, that the Great Depression was the result of government management of the economy. It wasn't that the government needed to intervene to save the economy from the Great Depression. Government caused the Great Depression. Okay, and Doug points out something that I think others haven't talked about so much, which is there were governments, we were on the gold standard, and there were governments that were hoarding gold, France in particular. And taking gold out of circulation raises the price of gold, which is another way of saying it causes deflation. So the shock of the deflation on the US economy was pretty bad. People who had debts, those debts suddenly got much larger because of the deflation. Farmers couldn't pay their debts, banks failed, we had the Great Depression. Okay. As a comparison, less well known, for what you'll see why, was something that was caused retroactively, the Depression of 1920-21. So after World War I, okay, it was hard for the economy to adjust to the change in peace from wartime to peacetime demands, and there was a recession. The economy, there was high unemployment, all these kinds of things. The government did absolutely nothing. Okay, it was against their principles. The idea hadn't really appeared yet. So recovery was very quick without the government doing anything. And it was followed by what became called the Roaring '20s. Okay, got over that recession. It was a really bad one, but very short. Curry came out of it itself without any government macro policy. And it was followed by an incredible period of growth and prosperity, the Roaring '20s. Okay? Those of you who've taken Econ 26 have heard me talk about the financial crisis of 2008. Okay? And again, the story here is the financial system is inherently unstable, and we need government regulation to make it more stable. okay? The reality, which I go into in my talk, is that instability is actually the result of the intervention. Okay, it's imposing this managerial structure on the financial system, causes all kinds of unexpected effects, which combine to make it very unstable. And there's a very good book on this by Meir and Hanover, in which they, among many things, they compare the US to Canada. Okay, two pretty similar economies, but Canada has never intervened much in its financial system. Okay, the US intervenes in the financial system more than any country except the Democratic Republic of Congo. Okay, so we're in good company. Okay, and Meir and Hanover notes that you can compare what has been the result, how many financial crises. So in the last, I don't know, 150 years, the US, I'm making up the numbers because I don't remember them, the US had 12 major financial crises. Canada in the same period had 0. Okay. So again, the imposition of the managerial approach, we have to manage the financial system to make it stable, actually has the opposite effect. Another example, development aid. Okay, William Easterly has a book called The White Man's Burden about this, and he talks about the difference. He doesn't call it managers and entrepreneurs, he calls it planners versus searchers. So the planners who are giving aid to cause development, they have goals like we will eliminate poverty in 20 years, okay? And they do all kinds of things. Who it describes as the searchers are people who want to help with development, and they look for profit opportunities. What can we do that would be helpful? Okay, they actually can have a significant effect. They're the searchers, okay, entrepreneurs. Another area, again, the government funding of science, okay? So the story which was pushed after World War II was that science is a public good. And as a result, there's a market failure. There's too little funding for science. So the government has to correct this market failure by funding science, and it did, and it eventually took over most of the funding of science. The problem is this is managerial funding. And we have had, as a result, what is known as the crisis of science. Okay, so as a result of this lavish funding, we now have way more scientists than we did before, huge number, producing an incredible number of professional papers. But if you look, what has all this done to advance science? The answer is not much. Okay, so it's really a lot of, pretty much a waste of money. One of the main reasons, again, comes down to failures, okay? If you want to get a government grant, you have to give a proposal which assures the bureaucrats running it that there's no chance of failure. This is not a good proposal. Science moves forward through failures. Okay, there's a very good book on the nature of science with the title Failure. Okay, why is failure so important? Well, it turns out that for good science, having questions is at least as important as finding answers to questions. Okay, so there haven't been enough good new questions, and the result is people have worked on answers to smaller and smaller questions related to existing things. Where do you get the questions? So there's a saying that it's attributed to Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer, and it's not clear whether it really was him. He says, well, what is the exclamation you hear where there's a major advance in science? Okay, and the natural, you would naturally say, Eureka. Okay, he says, no. What indicates a real advance in science is an exclamation, that's funny. Okay, we have a new question. Okay, that's going to lead to new discoveries. Okay. So government funding prevents that. Okay, that's not going to happen. Okay, a good illustration of that is Katalin Kariko, okay, a biologist. Okay, I don't know exactly the details. She spent decades of work researching mRNA. Okay, that was sort of her area. Her grant applications were generally rejected because they were considered too much risk of failure. But she was under constant pressure from her university employers. She didn't have tenure because grants mean overhead. You've seen that recently, a lot of overhead. So they want their researchers to get grants. She never got tenure because the managerial metric for success is grants received, how many grants and how much money have you received, and how many articles have you published in top journals. Did the grants lead to good research? Were the articles interesting? Doesn't matter. The metric is quantitative, okay? And she was eventually fired by the University of Pennsylvania. She went through a number of employers. Not only she didn't get tenure, they kicked her out. So she managed to find a job at a tech startup, BioNTech, where she helped develop the mRNA vaccine, which during the COVID epidemic saved millions of lives. Okay, and she actually won the Nobel Prize in 2023, Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. So it's kind of ironic that someone who couldn't get tenure under the current system wins the Nobel Prize in medicine. Okay, so the pattern here is that this managerial approach to things that are essentially entrepreneurial kills them. And that's the reason that so much government intervention is harmful rather than helpful. And it isn't easy to see how it could be fixed. Government is by its very nature managerial, top-down. Yeah, so you know what my solution is. All right, I'm done.
Thank you. Questions for Professor Kohn?
Aaron, yay!
Yeah, so you said the functions of the government are inherently entrepreneurial. And
No, they're managerial.
Oh, okay.
We lost the question.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wish. No, it's not true.
I can actually have
We have a question over here.
So in your lecture that you argued that government intervention, whether through full-scale planning or partial regulation, leads to undermine entrepreneurial dynamics, which then lead to poor outcomes. However, there are some cases where I feel like market actors behave rationally within a capitalistic framework, but externalize costs, such as like environmental degradation.
Yeah.
So how might some form of partial planning or regulation be necessary to prevent systematic harm?
I think, let's say that there is no other. Very often the solution to externalities is people get together to deal with them. Okay, Elinor Ostrom, an economist, got a Nobel Prize in economics for pointing this out. Okay, there's an externality problem called the what is it called? Tragedy of the commons. Okay, so there's a bunch of ranchers which all graze their cattle on the same range. Okay, everyone tries to use it to the maximum possible. There's overgrazing. Everyone is hurt. Okay, that's the tragedy of the commons. So she went and actually looked at ranchers and how they behave, and you know what? They actually get together and they figure out how much everybody is allowed to, how many cattle they're allowed to graze and for how long, and the problem is taken care of. So very often there are non-government solutions. Okay, economists assume there aren't any, but there are, because people get together and they find solutions. So maybe environmental things like CO2 in the atmosphere, it's too broad. You need all the humans in the world to get together. No, so it makes sense for government to do something if you think it needs to be addressed. That's controversial, but assume. Then you should go about it very conscious of the problems of government intervention. Okay, you try to do it with the least managerial harm to the economy. Okay, if you just go ahead and pass regulations and do things, the results will be really bad. Okay, so maybe if you're aware of the problem, you can take care and do it less harmfully. I wish you luck. I'm not, I'm not very optimistic, but that's the best you can do. If there's really no solution but the government, then you should at least be conscious of the problem. Yeah. Over here. Hank.
So I'm kind of curious, right now the government is decreasing funding for science, and there's a lot of articles out there about how that's going to be very detrimental for our economy. So you're saying that there's problems inherently in government intervention that's causing there to be less entrepreneurial endeavors in science, but then taking it out inherently is currently causing economic problems. So how do you see us altering?
It'll be difficult to adjust.
Yes, how do we alter and make the most
adjustment
efficient
will be-
economy?
The way it worked before, and it worked very well, was two kinds of funding. One was by philanthropists. Okay, and there's some of that still today, Bill Gates and all kinds of things. So there would be more of that. Okay, they would rise to the task. Another source before that was the private sector. Okay, if you're a firm and you have a research department, you have like Bell Labs was a good example. Okay, you have people doing work for you on problems you're interested in. And you want really good people, and in particular, people who can read the literature and find the things that are relevant to what you're doing. In order to be able to read the literature, you have to be participating in creating the literature. Okay, so working at Bell Labs, it was a bit like 3M. A certain proportion of your time was devoted to doing your own research, and that was good. They wanted people who were interested in doing research. So that was one source of private funding. Harvard could use its $53 billion endowment to fund some research as well. Okay, so universities could provide some funding. They're not poor. And if they wanted to raise money from this, from alums, philanthropists, then they probably could. There may be less research. Okay, it may be hard for scientists to adjust. People may have to get other jobs. But I would guess that the science will be much better. And when we look back, we'll say, oh, that was really good. I mean, if it actually happens, right? We're just at the beginning, but if they carry through on that. So that would be a very good outcome. It's very hard. I mean, there's no way of doing it gradually. It would be nice to do it gradually so people could adjust, but that's politically difficult. I don't know. Again, I don't know how to do that, but the thing itself is good. The other thing I mentioned was foreign aid. Foreign aid generally does harm. It's not just that it's not helpful, it does harm. So shutting down US aid, okay, which is another thing that Doge has been responsible for, is good. Developing countries will do better without it. Yes?
Pardon, Shao, you hear me?
Yeah, I think I can, yes.
Well,
Can you think of an example of a company that's maintained an entrepreneurial culture? Because in the examples of 3M and Boeing, it almost seemed like there was this propensity towards settling into a managerial culture, having this phase of like rampant innovation. So what are the forces, and if that's successful for a company, logically you'd think they would continue that. So what do you think coerces a company
Maybe
into?
right. I mean, there may be sort of a life cycle that this doesn't last. I don't know. I mean, that's more detail than I have in my in my head. But it's a very good question. It may just be a kind of a natural development, and the market deals with that by creating new companies, okay, who are at an earlier and more productive phase. So it doesn't necessarily, it isn't necessarily bad. Yeah. Okay, but good question.
how do you think artificial intelligence is in the entrepreneurship and
I think every lecture I've given, that came up. AI came up. So what is the question about AI?
does it fit into the entrepreneurial and manager roles?
AI can't be entrepreneurial. Okay, it requires imagination. It requires all kinds of qualities that AI doesn't have. So I don't think it could be helpful in that. There was a very good article, I think it was actually maybe in the Wall Street Journal, about sort of new research on whether AI has intelligence, and the results are not very favorable. I never sort of believed in it. It didn't make sense to me that you could sort of, all kinds of things about humans, like entrepreneurship, optimism, pessimism, feelings, all these sorts of things, doesn't have. And those are necessary for entrepreneurship. Yeah, this music sounds really good. How would AI know that? Okay. If it's like something else that's good, maybe, but this is something completely new and it sounds fantastic. How would AI know that it sounds fantastic? It doesn't hear the music. Yeah.
But you can learn what other people like.
Sorry?
It doesn't have to like it itself. It can learn what
Right,
other
but
people like.
okay.
That's what more.
But this is new. This is a new genre. Okay, should we do it? Somebody talked about which movies should we do. Okay, we have lots of screenplays. Should we do this movie? And let's ask AI. Good luck.
From my understanding, a lot of kind of biomedical startups and kind of like scientific-based entrepreneurial endeavors begin in the university setting.
Yes.
So don't you, from my interpretation, it seems like there are these entrepreneurial instincts that come about after something is discovered. Like, it doesn't make sense for you to get venture funding to start a project if you don't have some sort of scientific discovery beforehand.
Yeah.
So do you feel like the government funding in that sense towards universities
Well, the government wouldn't fund those things. That's why the the biotech will take a flyer, take a chance on things. Okay,
But aren't governments funding the universities like grants that then lead to those biotech discoveries?
Okay, you're keeping a scientist busy. Okay, you're paying his salary, and he may have some good ideas while he's on the payroll. Okay, but if he wants to do something with those ideas, he has to go outside the framework, which is fine. But it suggests that that if you're interested in biotech science, you might offer more grants to university scientists in the hope that a sufficient number will come up with good ideas that you can then buy. Yeah, but yeah, it's a good point. But the private sector is, it comes up with solutions for things. If there are opportunities there, people will figure out how to take advantage of them. That's called entrepreneurial.
But I feel like you can't get that innovation unless you have some scientists working on that beforehand, right? Like, if no one's going to fund a scientist who has no discovery.
No, but you could. Scientists, it's not my area. I don't know how it works, but scientists work in a lab for other people, first of all. Okay, they don't start off by doing original research, or their own original research. They work for somebody else, and then they have ideas, and then they say, well, maybe I could get a grant and do this myself. That's sort of the way it goes. But we need to find better ways of doing it, because the current way just doesn't work very well with government funding.
So where do you think we are going?
Well, at the moment, things look relatively good for this view of things, in that we have an administration that is committed to reducing the role of government and regulation and bureaucracy and all these things. We'll see how it turns out. I don't know. Yep.
Wouldn't tariffs be attempt of government?
Yeah, that's terrible. That's you could think of it as a kind of industrial. That's not a good good development. I'm not in favor. But the Doge stuff I like.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the fact that Harvard and Columbia and various others are so upset, I take that as a very good sign. Dartmouth isn't, by the way. Dartmouth is we're doing okay.
Time for one more question.
Yes.
Any thoughts on the French Revolution?
Apropos of what? To use French.
Well, I don't know, there's an argument to be made that a king is much more entrepreneurial and has much more incentive to think about the net present value of his kingdom than a president would or a democracy would.
I don't think the evidence particularly supports that. No. I think commercial societies are the ones that are very productive of new ideas, not predatory. We can't remember a couple of the talks. I think it came up. There's two different types of government: predatory government and associational government. And associational government was mainly historically of commercial cities, so it was also commercial government. That kind of government, the cities actually competed in sponsoring science. Okay, a lot of the new science of the, I don't know, whenever it happened, 16th, 17th century, 18th century, was sponsored by the cities because they wanted to outdo the other cities. Just as they sponsored the arts, they sponsored science. So it was just showing off. Okay, we're contributing to human knowledge. And it wasn't the rulers. The rulers were not sponsoring science. So whether you have the French predatory government, the predatory government of the French king or the predatory government of the revolutionaries doesn't make much difference in this respect. So.
Thanks very much, Professor Kohn, and thank you all.
Thank you.